All right, hello everybody. Today I am finally getting back to you with my, I guess, like study guide or analysis or discussion of the first half of the first chapter of Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. Now, I uh, I don't know how dense this book is going to be. It's not a long book, but if all the chapters are as dense as chapter one is, we're going to be in for quite a trip, as you will see. I covered the first 16 pages or so, about half of chapter one, and it is a deep dive into Austrian economic theory, and I wanted to split this up so that it's a little bit more easily digestible for people. You know, there'll be a new video. Pardon me. There'll be a new video out on the second half of the chapter, hopefully soon. This one took a little extra time because number one, I keep coughing, and number two, I actually did record it a couple days ago. I tried recording it in my office, but the echo was so bad that I just said this is not going to work out. So I might need to get one of those like lapel microphone things if I'm going to try that. It'd be nice to actually record videos in my office because, you know, there's like bookshelves and it's more interesting of a background. But I'm trying to figure out because like part of the thing that makes it part of the thing that makes me procrastinate about making videos is that I have to like put up the background and stuff every time. So anyway, let's get right down to it. So, first half of the first chapter of America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard. Now, the first chapter here is going to be about Austrian business cycle theory. In fact, the title of the chapter is The Positive Theory of the Cycle. And so this is going to get pretty theoretical. The rest of the book is probably going to be a little bit more historical. But Rothbard says, and this is how he actually starts the chapter out, he says that just having a bunch of data doesn't actually give you what you need to interpret events, historical events. In order to interpret data, you need a framework. And that framework can be very complicated or it can be very simple, but you need that framework. So theory is that framework. You can look at it from a Keynesian perspective, you can look at it from an Austrian perspective, you can look at it from a classical perspective or a neoclassical perspective, but in any case, you need some kind of framework to tell you what data is important and how to interpret it and how to structure it. There's just no way around that. Otherwise, you have basically an unlimited amount of data to play around with, and you can kind of come to whatever conclusion you want. Theory is what allows you to figure out what is important. And of course, competing theories, you can come up with different interpretations, but the question is how well does that interpretation jive with the data that you actually have. So, you need theory. In addition to needing theory, that theory must be integrated with the rest of economics. If your theory of the business cycle is somehow divorced from the rest of economics, as it is in Keynesianism, your economics must be wrong. Rothbard doesn't directly say Keynesianism there, but you kind of can tell that he's making that jive when he's talking about this. Anyway, yeah. So he says, you must reject proposed explanations that conflict with general economics. You need to have a system that is integrable, that covers everything. And so that's kind of what he claims the Austrian business cycle theory does, that it integrates into the rest of Austrian economics very well, and that it explains the business cycles and allows you to it gives you a framework with which you can interpret this data. With these data, sorry. So, before Rothbard gets into the actual theory, he has to make a distinction. He has to make a very careful definition. There is a difference, he says, between business cycles and business fluctuations. This seems obvious, but, he's trying to be clear here. The economy is always inherently fluctuating. It's always inherently changing. Entrepreneurs are coming up with ideas on what to do with existing stuff. Stuff is being produced. That stuff that's being produced is being figured out what to do with it by other entrepreneurs. Therefore, stabilization of the economy as a whole is kind of a fool's errand. Rothbard gives an example of like a 7-year locust cycle. In such an economy, every 7 years, the anti-locust industry gets a huge boom, and then the other 6 of 7 years, it has a massive bust, right? Now, Rothbard says there's no point in trying to smooth out that boom-bust cycle, because If you do, you're just going to end up wasting materials in the other 6 years on machines that aren't going to get used or are going to deteriorate somewhat before they are used, right? Imagine that you made a bunch of airplanes with insecticide sprayers, and some percentage of them fail before they're actually useful. You want entrepreneurs to figure out when things need to be built so that they're there when they're needed, and not, rust out in an obscure warehouse somewhere. So, yeah, that's the rule. That's the role of entrepreneurship. The role of entrepreneurship is for dealing with these changes and figuring out how to make the economy work with them, or deal with them and serve humanity as best as possible. Fluctuations, as Rothbard defines it, they move materials, resources, labor, etc., between industries. There's not a general depression or a general boom. There might be a slow upward or slow downward depending on the overall situation in the economy, but generally speaking, these fluctuations move resources from A over to B, and maybe even B, C, D, E, F, etc. The problem of the cycle, of the business cycle that Rothbard wants to laser in on, is the problem of general booms and general depressions. And therefore, periodic cycles where you can tell every 6 years this is going to happen, every 12 years this is going to happen, every 25 years this is going to happen, these aren't relevant to the theory of the general boom and depression. They're generally special cases, and they're predictable, which is another thing. Now, here Rothbard gets into a point that I think is a little bit overstated. So let's look at this real quick. Rothbard states that general price changes must come from a disturbance in the monetary sphere, because all transactions involve the monetary sphere, and anything that affects things that aren't in the monetary sphere are going to have a small effect on a limited number of industries, as opposed to a monetary thing, which every transaction has a money aspect to it, right? So I think this is overly positive. I think this is overly stated in the book, because there are things like unexpected natural disasters which could damage a large variety of existing goods and cause a general depression. I think that Rothbard would say that, yes, obviously I'm not talking about things where there's an obvious causal reason for the depression. Fair enough. However, I do want to still say that for goods that are not perfectly broad, and all goods are not perfectly broad, right? Everything has some limited set of use cases for it. In those cases, the destruction of one type of goods, or a few types of goods, say, could affect prices across production if the substitutes for those goods also encompass those other types of production. So I'm not exactly sure what kind of example would be a great example for this, but you could have a bust in one industry where, because that industry uses goods, uses producers' goods that are generally usable as substitutes in other areas, that because of that you might see a general loss because of a loss in one industry where things were brought in, and those things are good substitutes everywhere else. I haven't really gotten it into a perfectly detailed theory, but there is something here to think about, I would say, and I think that Rothbard's being a little overly positive when he says that any general price fluctuation must come from the monetary sphere. I think that if you thought about it long enough, you could probably come up with a couple of counterexamples. Putting that aside, Rothbard notes that the bust is generally, the busts that he's talking about are generally heralded by a cluster of errors by entrepreneurs. A bunch of business owners start making the wrong decisions in a systematic and widespread way, right? Rothbard states, and I think that he's being a little overly positive here too. He states that in a free market, not all entrepreneurs will err at the same time, unless there's something that causes them all to err at the same time. And the problem, of course, is that Rothbard makes a case for one thing that will make them err all at the same time. The problem is that I think that there's probably other examples that might also apply. But let's even set that aside. Rothbard is focusing in on one particular aspect that causes this for sure. Like, there's no question about that. And what he's talking about is bank credit expansion. Now, note he doesn't say central bank credit expansion. He says bank credit expansion because this can be done by private banks just, a little bit more difficult, with only a little bit more difficulty than how a central bank in a, monetary sovereign country can do that. Now, Rothbard starts to get into actual economics here. Time preference. Time preference is one of the fundamental aspects of Austrian economic theory to begin with. The idea that if there's a good that is not going to deteriorate over time, let's say $1, right? I will generally choose to have $1 today over $1, absolutely certain $1 a year from now. And the reason for that is because the value of goods, the subjective value of goods, is dependent on the range of desires, of felt wants or needs that can be filled by that good. And simply because that dollar can fill needs over a wider period of time, that is the period between now and 1 year from now, I could use that dollar if I need to, means that it is capable of fulfilling more wants. Therefore, it has higher value, something along those lines. Everybody has a different time preference. This is something that a lot of highly macrotized economic theories don't figure out. Everybody has a different time preference. You might be the kind of person who maintains a balance on your credit card. That's a low time preference type of action. You might be the kind of person that won't even take out a loan for a mortgage. That's a very high time preference perspective, right? And everybody's a little bit different. You might say, "Oh, I'll take out a loan for 4%. That'll work. I'll take out a loan for." Whereas you might say, "Oh, but 6% is too much." But then somebody else will take the 6%, and that same guy might say, "Well, 8% is too much." There'll be somebody who takes out that 8%, right? So what this does is it creates a market for time and money, right? There will be people who have surplus money, and they will loan it to people who have higher time preference, right? It's very easy to get low time preference and high time preference confused. High time preference means that you care about time a lot. You are willing to have high interest debts. Low time preference means that you look at the things in the long run, and the value of things far out is not that much diminished from things that are close in, right? Pretty sure that's right. But the point is that all of these different rates of time preference that people have when there's allowed to be a market for loans, create something like a market rate of interest or a natural rate of interest. Rothbard calls this the pure interest rate. In addition to calling it the natural rate or even the rate of profit, because capital investments require the interest, because whenever you're going to make a capital investment in a business, you're always asking whether that investment is better or worse than something you can get by just going to a 100% redeemable bond kind of thing, or almost 100%, even an almost 100% redeemable bond, right? If you have a bunch of money. If you have a bunch of wealth, you'd be better, and you can't think of anything to do with it that would give you a better return than those bonds, then you may as well just get the bonds. So, here's the problem. The problem is that banks sometimes decide to create additional money substitutes, or in the fiat case, they just produce more money. When they do this, and then when they loan that money to businesses, the loan rate of interest goes down because the people who are, looking for a 6% loan have already been served if that's the natural rate of interest. When all this extra money comes in and they want to loan it, they start to look at people who look at a 5.9%, 5.8%, 5.7%. So the interest rate goes down when that extra money is flushed into the system for loans. Now, what happens when the rate of interest goes down? Well, to think about this, you have to think about how people act based on their rate of time preference. People with extremely high time preference are short-term oriented. They invest only in short-term projects. They do things that pay them out soon, or if not now. Low time preference people look at long-term projects, and those low time preference people have a lower rate of interest. Now the problem is that when the rate of interest is decreased by this fake bank credit expansion, entrepreneurs see the interest rate go down and they say, oh, people are saving more. That's interesting. And the signal that tells entrepreneurs to do is it tells them to start investing in longer processes. People are willing to wait more now, they say. But in fact, that's not the case. That bank credit expansion was not accompanied by a change in consumer preferences to give them a longer view, a lower time preference. However, the entrepreneurs are getting the signal, and what it causes them to do is it causes them to buy and invest in producers' goods, bidding up their price. This price increase in producers' goods kind of percolates down through the economy. It shows up elsewhere. It shows up in substitutes. It shows up in products. Because what's basically happening is that a bunch of resources are getting taken over to projects that are new that wouldn't have been started if you were still at the natural rate of interest. These are if the natural rate of interest was 6%, these are projects that are only profitable over 5.5%, say, something like that. You wouldn't do that. I guess my point is that if you can get 6% for, certainly, there's no reason to invest in a business that gives you 5.5, right? So, the problem is that the people, the consumers, continue to spend and save just as they did before, with the same ratio of spending to saving that would lead to the natural rate of interest that we were just saying was 6%. And so what happens is that this demand for long production process projects collapses. When this happens, the capital that was invested in these longer production processes, some of it, not all of it, but some of it must be liquidated. Because, as I've said before, goods are not perfectly substitutable. Once you take steel and you make it into a car frame, in order to melt it back into steel ingots, you would take a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of labor, a lot of money, and you might have even done things to the steel that make it less, that make it no longer, you may have stressed out the steel and now you need to re-anneal it or something like that. There's all kinds of things that would make goods less substitutable as they get further through the production process. So, these capital investments that need to be liquidated are malinvestments. And by the way, it's important to note that depending on how aware the entrepreneur is, it might not even necessarily be all of the 5.5% loan projects that fail. There might be some guy who had a perfectly good project at 6%, but now he's like, well, wait a minute, the price of lumber just went up 20%. What the heck just happened? I didn't buy it beforehand. I didn't think I needed to pile up lumber. I was using the funds that I have now for other things. I was going to buy the lumber later. Now this project that should have been profitable is not able to be completed, at least in the time frame that it was expected to be completed. And of course, if it's not completed when it should be completed, you've got a little bit more loss there. So you got to think about that. So that is what happens when you have bank credit expansion. At least that's Rothbard's opinion, or not opinion, but argument. After he kind of goes through this series of cause and effect relationships, he looks at something called the underconsumption hypothesis. He basically says that some groups say that the reason for depression is because consumers aren't consuming enough. You're not eating enough. Therefore, that's why we're having a depression. You've stopped consuming. Therefore, consumption industry, retail industries that supply consumers directly fail, which then trickles up the economy to the producers. The problem with this theory, with any underconsumption theory, underconsumption hypothesis, the problem with an underconsumption hypothesis is that if you actually look at the data, now we have a framework. Now you can look at the data. The data shows that capital goods invariably suffer more in these business cycle movements than consumer goods. Consumer goods are hurt, of course, but they're hurt to a lesser degree. And if the source of the problem was at the consumption level, you expect most of the damage to be there. Instead, what you actually see is you see capital goods and capital producers and users of capital goods suffering more than the consumers directly. It's like, yes, the average person in the Great Depression, for instance, yes, the average person found it a lot harder to live and find what they need and get enough work to make enough money to live at their previous standard of living. And in fact, some people on the margins did get forced into seriously dangerous if not deadly positions. But those differences were smaller on the margin than the destruction that went through the entire capital structure of the United States, and indeed a good chunk of the world. They lost 95%, say. I don't know what the actual number is. Hopefully it'll be in the book later on. But the point is that that the capital investments lost a lot more, and they lost first. I think is going to be another point that he makes, I hope. So there you go. It can't be underconsumption because that's not where we see the damage come in, and it's not where we see the damage be the most significant. So, continuing on, Rothbard notes that based on this theory of the boom and bust, it is a theory of the boom and bust because every bank credit expansion has two effects. The initial effect is the boom, that you get a bunch of extra investment, you get a bunch of extra capital moving around, you get a bunch of extra circulation of resources through the economy. However, when it is discovered that these investments are wasteful, that they are malinvestments, then comes the bust. And the bust is not like some kind of magical, what would you call it? Like magical, mystical comeuppance for these naughty entrepreneurs. What it actually is that the consumers themselves are reestablishing the desired proportions of saving to consumption. And when they do that, the natural rate of interest comes back into play, and people observe that, hey, I'm going to lose money on this. I thought I was going to make money, but I'm going to lose money. On the margin, some of those people who are going to lose money choose to liquidate instead. Some of the capital that is invested is not recyclable, is not reusable, is not substitutable elsewhere in the economy. That is lost. So that's kind of the very, very top level view of Rothbard's theory of the boom and bust. One more point to make is that he notes that a solution to the bust seems like it might be to increase the credit expansion, make a bunch more fake money substitutes or fiat money. The problem with this is that what it does is it lengthens the period of the boom. Now, that might sound good. Everybody seems happy for a longer time, but the problem with lengthening the boom is that, number one, more resources are diverted to malinvestments, right? To projects that are unprofitable, that are wasteful. Number two, those resources that are devoted to those projects and to projects that are going to be either delayed or also that fail because of the move of materials to these other new projects that shouldn't have been started, they get further along the process of production. And generally speaking, as a thing gets further along the process of production, it becomes more specialized to its purpose, right? The consumer good is the thing that you eat or use directly. And every step along the way, things are getting more and more close to producing those producers' goods, but they're still not really consumable. Imagine it's like having a bunch of petroleum. That's pretty substitutable. Fine. A bunch of petroleum and a bunch of cotton is pretty, and some steel, right? I'm working toward the car seat, right? Okay, so I'm working towards a car seat. That the raw materials, the petroleum that you need to use to make the padding, the cotton that you're going to use to make the upholstery, and the metal that you're going to use to make the frame that allows it to connect to the inside of the car. those are pretty substitutable when they're all in those raw forms. Then you take the petroleum and you turn it into foam. Well, that foam is usable in a variety of places, as long as it's still like a big old sheet of foam. You know, you can cut it out into a different shape and everybody's happy. But now you take that foam and you cut it into the shape of the car seat. Now it's really only applicable to car seats or to smaller goods than that, so you can cut out the shapes from the existing piece. You know, similarly, the cotton could be used for clothing, or it could be used for, you know, the material for upholstering the car. Once that material is made, you know, you could still cut it in a different pattern, and you could make some very ugly shirts out of it, maybe. But, you know, as it gets closer and closer to the actual, you know, consumer good, it becomes more and more specialized. It becomes less and less substitutable. There's less of it that you can recycle. You know, similarly, the metal, the steel is good as a steel ingot, or you can turn it into this frame, and maybe in doing that, you've hardened the steel, which means that it needs more processing to be turned back into an ingot, or even that, you know, it's been placed in a warehouse and part of it has kind of oxidized a little bit, and so even if you did melt it back into an ingot, you get less good steel out of it. Things like that. All of these goods, as the boom continues, all of these goods get more and more along. More of them get used on these unprofitable projects, and they become the materials that are used in these unprofitable projects further along the structure of production, which makes them less substitutable. Which means that when you actually get to the bust, it's going to be even more catastrophic. You've lost more goods. You've lost more materials. You've turned materials into less substitutable forms, meaning that you have to expend more energy to recycle them, if they're even recyclable at that point. So, that's the first half of Chapter 1 of Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. And as you can see, it's not like a huge book. Like, if I just open it up here, it's a little over 300 pages. It's not a super thick book. It's not like Man, Economy, and State, where you have just like, you know, 1,000, 1,200 pages of economics to go through. This is a much shorter book, but it's very, very dense. At least it has been so far. In the next episode, I'm going to try to make this into a series where I regularly do a discussion of a chapter or a fraction of a chapter of this book, and try to make it into kind of a nice playlist for you guys to go through and study guide kind of thing. Because I've read a bunch of Austrian stuff, and so I have a pretty good feel for interpreting this stuff, and even maybe I can even throw some references into it later on, because I can refer you to other books and stuff like that. Anyway, in the next episode of this, we're going to be, which might be the next video I post, I'm not sure, but anyway, in the next episode of this, we're going to cover the second half of Chapter 1, which is going to be kind of the secondary, the indirect effects of bank credit expansion. Rothbard, of course, goes into more detail, and we're going to get more fun economics from Rothbard here. And then after that, we're going to start going into the history, I suppose. Just a quick glance at the table of contents, because why wouldn't I just do a quick glance at the table of contents? Part 1, Business Cycle Theory, is chapters 1, 2, and 3. Part 2 is the inflationary boom between 1921 and 1929, which is chapters 4 through 6. Then part 3 is the actual Great Depression, 1929 through 1933, chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So that is the book. And that's kind of its structure. We will see how dense this remains. It may remain very dense, in which case we'll slow down and take our time. But my goal is to provide you with a little bit of a nice kind of listenable video discussion of each of these chapters, so that you can go through it and you know, have this in the background, or have this off to the side, so that you can you know, see if you're reaching the same conclusions that I am, or make sure that you don't miss any obvious giant points. That's kind of my goal here. So, yeah, first half, chapter 1, extremely dense so far. It may be that chapters 1 through 3 are extremely dense because they're the theory chapters, but we'll see. Next up, we're going to have the second half of chapter 1, and we're just going to move on from there. So yeah, this has been, I don't know, what would you call it? I guess part 1 of many of our discussion of Murray Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression. And, you know, all these books are like very reasonably priced at the Mises Institute. I would highly recommend picking up hard copies. If you can't, then there's a free PDF. I'll put links to that. I'll put links to everything up in the description so that you can get a copy for yourself in your preferred format. I love hard copies of books because it means that I don't have to ever worry about a website going down or power being out and I can't get anything. So, and like really good books, I like to have hard copies. Maybe you do too, maybe not. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate any comments or thoughts that you want to add to that. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.